welcome everyone again. We're so excited to hear from Melissa again this afternoon. Your reading resonated all day, and I know beyond, Melissa. So thank you so much again for joining us in this vaguely awkward platform, but we're so happy to have you and eager to hear your craft talk. And when you're finished, there'll be some time for a few questions. So take it away, Melissa.
Great, thank you. Just a quick question. Am I a host on here, or can I do a screen sharing for my PowerPoint?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So hi, everybody. Thank you for coming again. I am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint. And just know that this is, I think, the one of 2 PowerPoints that I've ever made in my life, and I don't even know how to fill out the whole slide with my images. So this is like really rudimentary. So I think it gets the point across. It gives you something to look at other than me. Okay, let's see. Okay, slide here. Okay, can everybody see this sort of gross navel image? Okay, great. Let me just make sure. Yeah, it works. Okay, cool. So every time that I write a craft talk, I plan to talk about very technical stuff because I talk about technical stuff a lot in my classes. I am forever drawing plot graphs and diagrams and things. But then I often end up writing another kind of craft talk, the kind that's just about getting to the page and the things that get in our way. And I'm sure that you have a bunch of amazing teachers. I know you do, in fact, in this program. So I decided to yield to that impulse. And so I'm not going to draw you a graph this time, although I will happily share some with you if you're interested. But before I get into what I'm going to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about lists because I love lists, and I have some images of some lists here. In March of 2014, I saw Lorraine Hansberry's notebooks in an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum, and these are actually photographs of some covert pictures that I took with my phone. So, I mean, you know, they're floating around on the internet, so I'm not the only one. The writer of A Raisin in the Sun, Hansberry was also a lister. Every year between her late 20s and early 30s, she repeated inventories with the headings I like, I hate, I want, I am bored with. At 28, as you can see in this list, she likes Renee Kaplan's legs, slacks, being hungry, conversations with James Baldwin, and Eartha Kitt's eyes, voice, legs, and music. She hates loneliness, pictures of herself, and people who don't appreciate Kitt. She's bored by A Raisin in the Sun, a feeling that those of us who have written long projects can probably relate to, and most sexual experience. She wants to be in love. At 31, she loves the sweet innocence of certain raucous lesbians I know. Hazel eyes, apparently. The first drink of scotch, the second, and the third. At 32, she loves 69 when it really works. The inside of a lovely woman's mouth. Some ideas of Brecht's. And those rare mornings when I wake without unhappiness. Also at 32, she hates my fears, my god-awful fears of almost everything. And she also introduces a new category, I regret. Read sequentially, they make a kind of Bildungsroman of lists, a story of sexual awakening in which maturity is signified by the discovery of regret. My story also didn't include regret until about 32 either, the age at which, like Hansberry, I came to know my own fear in a different kind of way. When I went to the museum that day, I was struggling. I was in the middle of writing what I had thought would be a 50-page essay. I referenced this last night, and it had grown to over 100 pages. It had begun as a straightforward account of meeting my birth father for the first time. Along the way, it had been intercepted by a love story, by the end of that love story, by material from my early childhood, by the ideas of D.W. Winnicott, Emile Cioran, and George Santayana, among many others. I had sent a draft of it to a trusted reader, and she had responded to it by first complimenting me, as all good readers know to do, and then pointing out that this is a good story, but it's not the story of what happened. If you want to tell that story, you're going to have to be more honest. It was hard news to receive. I spent a long time at the museum that day, hunched over the glass boxes that held Hansberry's notebooks. Her lists helped me to understand my own impulse to inventory. Oh, I think there's one more. No. Here you go. I had always been a compulsive lister. Probably some of you are also compulsive listers. I find that it's a pretty common trait among writers. I keep a separate notebook that's just for lists, as opposed to my notebook in which I keep my actual notes. My first diary was full of lists. It had a light green cover and this like exquisite little miniature lock. And in it, I maintained comprehensive records of all the books I read, because how else would I know when I had finished them all as I intended? I listed books I wanted to read, art I wanted to see, albums to acquire, films to watch. I kept meticulous lists of songs I loved, places to travel, projected earnings from summer jobs, and my friends in descending order of endearment. I think it was an early form of self-soothing. I listed myself to sleep. I ticked off items on my fingers on the school bus. And as a teenager, I made mixtape after mixtape, agonizing over order and annotating their playlists in fine-tipped pens. This habit didn't ease until I started writing my first book, Whip Smart, and has never fully eased. I'm still a real avid list maker. Hansberry was studying herself, tracking her own patterns, interrogating her tastes, trying to know herself, trying to make sense of the world through the lens of her own inclinations. She was chasing down her hidden parts, arranging their clues in comforting rows, lining up the evidence like cans on a pantry shelf. She was always a political writer. An outspoken civil rights activist, she was a friend to James Baldwin and Nina Simone, who wrote the song Young, Gifted, and Black about her. But she was never a lesbian writer. At the time, there hardly was such a thing. Maybe being a Black writer was marginal enough. The content of her most famous work, A Raisin in the Sun, was lifted heavily from her own family's experience, of which she said, "My memories of this correct way of fighting white supremacy in America include being spat at, cursed, and pummeled in the daily trek to and from school. And I also remember my desperate and courageous mother patrolling our household all night with a loaded German Luger, doggedly guarding her 4 children, while my father fought the respectable part of the battle in the Washington court." Investors considered the play a huge risk. With a virtually all-Black cast, it was the first of its kind, the first to introduce details of Black lives to the overwhelmingly white audiences of Broadway. Now, of course, it is legendary. But I suspect it was a terrifying decision for Hansberry to make. To write about your own wounds, the other people they implicate in your family, your community, your country, never stops being terrifying. It has been my experience that the unseen parts of us have the most gravity, the parts we hide and hide from. They simultaneously repel and compel us. It's also been my experience that writing about them is the only way for me to be free, and also the most socially useful kind of writing I've ever done. Before I wrote this talk, I wrote half a talk about unconventional nonfiction structures, about radical forms. And then I realized that I wanted to back up a little bit, that I wanted to talk about navel gazing. That is, writing about your own experience. Because I realized while writing that craft essay about radical forms that for some of us, including many women, queer people, people of color, the differently abled, those who subvert gender expectations, and any other swath of artists working in what might be called marginal topics, writing our stories about the physical, psychological, and intellectual experience of being and becoming is inherently a radical form. I'm not going to make an argument for writing about yourself unless that's what you already know you want to do. And maybe you don't know yet. What I'm going to try to do is counter all the voices that will tell you not to. What I want to do is give you permission, and maybe you don't need it. I'm not the person who decides who gets to write what, but sometimes I need a reminder to hear out of someone else's mouth that I'm allowed. So before I really get into things here, I want everyone to make a list. Does everyone have a pen and a piece of paper somewhere handy? You can do it on your computer, but this is the kind of list that I think is better on paper if you can manage it. What I want you to do is write down a list of 3 things that you don't think you could ever write about. That means that it wouldn't be polite to write about, that you couldn't find the words for, that you could never let anyone else see, that you could never be seen having said. So that betrayal, that humiliation, that addiction, that obsession, that thing you said to someone you love that you can never unsay, or that was said to you that can never be unsaid, the thing that can't be undone, that regret, the truth you fear you'll be punished in some way for speaking. If you need to write it in a code, that's fine. I have had to write things for the first time in code sometimes. But just a list, 3 items. And I'll just give you a minute to do that. I've also included in my PowerPoint one of my former such lists for encouragement. They're checked off because I ended up writing about all of these things. My guess is that most of you didn't even need that much time, because those subjects tend to sit very silently, very near the surface. Now put that list away and don't think about it. Turn it over, put it in your pocket, whatever. We're not going to return to it later. And for now, I want to talk a little bit more about the bias against personal writing. Basically, this bias that I'm referring to is summed up in the words of the German philosopher Friedrich Schlegel in 1978. And he said, pure autobiographies are written either by neurotics who are fascinated by their own ego, as in Rousseau's case, or by authors of a robust artistic or adventurous self-love, such as Benvenuto Cellini, or by born historians who regard themselves only as material for historic art, or by women who also coquette with posterity, or by pedantic minds who want to bring even the most minute things in order before they die and cannot let themselves leave the world without commentaries. This is basically the same thing that William Gass wrote in Harper's in 1994 as a response to the surge of popular memoirs that began in 1967 with Frank Conroy's Stop Time and Just Kept Going. And he said, are there any motives for the enterprise that aren't tainted with conceit or a desire for revenge or a wish for justification? To halo a sinner's head, to puff an ego already inflated past safety. To have written an autobiography is already to have made yourself a monster. Why is it so exciting to say, now that everyone knows it already, I was born, I was born, I was born, I pooped in my pants, I was betrayed, I made straight A's. This about sums up the current argument against personal writing. And when I say personal writing, I mean an examination of the self and the self's experience, the body, whether it's called memoir or autobiographical fiction or essay or poem or theater. So I'm very tired of this argument. The suggestion that personal writing is a lesser art or demands less artfulness, the claim that personal narrative is not intellectual or that it negates the intellectual merit of a piece of writing, and the most reviled perception of personal writing or any kind of writing, that it might serve to function as a kind of therapy. Virginia Woolf's father, Leslie Stephen, said, and I don't have a slide for him because he looks exactly like the last two dudes, autobiography is so generally interesting that I have frequently thought with the admirable Benvenuto Cellini that it should be considered as a duty by all eminent men, and indeed by men not so eminent. And it's true that audiences have always been interested in the stories of eminent men. Even before the word memoir became popular, we had Thoreau's Walden, Twain's Life on the Mississippi, and myriad others. This bias against personal narrative, that it's indulgent, solipsistic, irrelevant, narcissistic, and uncrafted, doesn't apply to everyone and doesn't trouble everyone. Of those of us inclined to write it, I see mostly women worrying our stories, imagining a threshold of confession that, if crossed, will invalidate our intellectual pursuit of ideas and answers and reduce us to diarists. Implicit in this bias and the resultant fear is the belief that these things cannot occupy the same space. And it's a grounded fear. In most of the interviews I gave after my first book was published, I fielded questions about my personal life and almost none about the ideas that I had labored so hard to hammer out in my story. My first book, Whip Smart, was about being a professional dominatrix and an addict. It was about desire and shame and bodies and drugs and money. And it was an intellectual inquiry into these topics as much as it was a psychological and emotional reckoning. I wrote it because I wanted to understand what the connections were between all of those things. I wrote it because writing is how I metabolize my own experience. It's how I think, and it's how I know what I feel. I wrote it because I wanted to demonstrate that inquiry and that reckoning for other women and for all people so that they would see it as a valuable practice, to examine our experiences and the contradictions we are fed as people inhabiting women's bodies in a culture that alternately worships and hates women's bodies. That these topics of the body, the emotional interior, the domestic, the sexual, and the relational are all undervalued in intellectual literary terms and are all associated with the female spheres of being is not a coincidence. What I'm saying is this bias is a sexist mechanism founded in the false binary between the emotional, the female, and the intellectual and the male, and intended to subordinate the former. Which is to say, Karl Nosgard is a genius, a risk taker, while all my female graduate students are terrified to write about being mothers for fear they will be deemed or that they already are vacuous narcissists. Or, as Maggie Nelson in her latest work says of a man inquiring how she could possibly pen a book on the subject of cruelty while pregnant, leave it to the old patrician white guy to call the lady speaker back to her body so that no one misses the spectacle of that wild oxymoron, the pregnant woman who thinks, which is really just a pumped up version of that other, more general oxymoron, a woman who thinks. This argument doesn't stop everyone from writing their stories. Mainly, it stops the people whose stories and stories like them have not often been told. And I think that that's the point. I was talking with a friend recently about the nature of teaching craft and how the nuts and bolts of writing can be hard to instruct. Because we can tell you how to omit needless words when dialogue is useful, what a scene is, but we can't teach you the most important thing, which is how to keep going, 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 and going. And when you think you're done, to keep going, 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 and going. It is so much harder than I thought when I was in my MFA. Totally worth it, but I'm glad I didn't know then how long it took to actually write a book. It surprises me all the time how it keeps getting challenging, which is why I keep doing it. And of course, it gets easier in other ways too, because you build instincts that you learn to trust. So this long essay that I was working on when I saw the Hansberry exhibit and the other essays in that collection, which became Abandon Me, I'd never worked so hard on anything, sentence by sentence, image by image. I spent years combing through those sentences. And I'd written critical work, I had written fiction, I'd written heavily researched pieces. And I can tell you that those essays, which incorporate critical elements, but are largely focused on my personal experiences, on interior experiences, were not easier to write. When we talk about the artfulness of writing, we are most often talking about form, about the mechanics of craft. No content, no matter how salacious or personal or shocking, will ever substitute for the work of craft. So this idea that memoirists are enjoying some loophole and effort by using their own lives as content doesn't really make any sense. And in fact, I found it to be much more work to apply my craft to topics of personal transformation, because it is all the craft work and then a shitload of emotional work on top of it. And while I have the capacity to deeply appreciate masterpieces of craft, without a certain emotional depth, I simply don't care. And I'm only speaking for myself here as a reader, but I want more than mechanics, more than experimentation, more than the aesthetics that we're talking about when we talk about craft. I want to feel on the page how the writer changed, how the writing changed them. And I believe that I often can. To see a writer's mind move on the page, to see them arrive at a deeper understanding of their own and the world's flaws and beauty is the thing that I read for. My mother once told me, she's a therapist. I said to her, how do you deal with just listening to people all day long, sitting in a quiet room? Like, don't you ever get sleepy? And she was like, you know what? I almost never do, because I'm so interested. And the only times when I do, I've learned through experience that as soon as I get sleepy or bored listening to someone, it's a clue that they've stopped being present in the session and that they're sort of phoning it in or detached from what's really happening. And she said, so I always use my sleepiness as a cue to sort of redirect or push them into a more honest state, which I thought was a really interesting analogy for how I experience writing that doesn't feel emotionally present, even if it technically is. I don't write to demonstrate my mastery of craft. I write to become a better person, because it's my best chance at being useful in a world that's already pretty much completely fucked. And because if I don't, I stop wanting to look at things. I stop looking at myself. I start choosing what is comfortable, what is easy, and my life becomes a practice of avoiding pain and indulging the fantasies that make it easier. The other thing that no craft talk can teach you is how to be brave, is to take the risk of honestly looking at yourself, of placing yourself in the context of this world. This is the opposite of narcissism, which is building a self-image that pleases you. In Letters to a Young Poet, Rilke wrote to a young soldier who aspired to write poems, "The work of the eyes is done. Go now and do the heart work on the images imprisoned within you." Which brings me to almost my final and also the most unpopular topic, which is catharsis. So I want to talk about the supposition that someone can publish their diary and elude the work of transforming their experience into art, which is a theory I've heard voiced with great disdain many times, with fear and disdain. And I have no idea who the self-indulgent and extravagantly well-connected narcissists who are supposedly writing in their therapeutic diaries and then dashing it off to be published, or who the people are who are publishing these books. But I'm guessing when people denigrate them in the abstract, they are picturing women. Here's the thing. I'm not saying that writing about yourself makes good writing. Good writing makes good writing. There are plenty of god-awful memoirs and personal essays and autobiographical poems out there, just as there are plenty of terrible novels. I have not noticed the memoir genres cornering the market on bad books. All books that fail to exhibit rigorous craft and emotional depth are taking a long, hard look into a shallow navel. The unpopular truth is that much writing, both good and bad, especially that which concerns the writer's experience, is therapeutic. In the 1980s, social psychologist James Pennebaker, widely recognized as one of our country's eminent researchers in language, emotion, and social dynamics, conducted some now very famous studies on his theory of expressive writing. Pennebaker instructed the participants in his experimental group to write about a past trauma, expressing their very deepest thoughts and feelings surrounding it. In contrast, the control group participants were asked to write as objectively and factually as possible about neutral topics without revealing their emotions or opinions. For both groups, the time scale was 15 minutes of continuous writing repeated over 4 days. 15 minutes over 4 days, so an hour total of writing spread out. It was also instructed that should a participant run out of things to write, they should go back to the beginning and repeat themselves, maybe writing it a little bit differently, but covering the same material. So Some of the participants in the experimental group who wrote about a past trauma found the exercise upsetting, but all of them found it valuable and meaningful. And monitoring over the following year revealed that those participants made significantly fewer visits to physicians, which following research has confirmed. These studies have been replicated many, many times. Expressive writing about trauma strengthens the immune system, it found, decreases obsessive thinking, and contributes to the overall health in every way of the writers. And that is after 4 days of 15 minutes per day. So, if you write about your wounds, it's probably going to be therapeutic in some way. And of course, the writing done in those 15 minutes or in any 15 minutes of continuous writing about a trauma is not art. But it's a logical fallacy to conclude that any writing with therapeutic effect is not good. You don't have to be in therapy to be healed by writing. Being healed does not have to be your goal. But to oppose the very idea of it is just kind of boneheaded. Of course, having a therapeutic experience while writing will not get your book published. It doesn't excuse you from the insanely hard work of making art. It's not easier, it's harder. And if you're doing it right, writing makes you know more, not less, which is also coincidentally what therapy does. Pulitzer Prize finalist Bruce Weigel, a veteran of the Vietnam War, said of the therapeutic benefits of writing, "What it helps you do is externalize things, give a shape to it. Look, you control it now. It doesn't control you anymore. You own it now." And though William Gass said that to have written an autobiography is already to have made yourself a monster, I will argue with him that refusing to write your story can also make you into a monster. Or maybe more accurately, we are already monsters in our own ways. And to deny the monstrous is to deny its beauty, its meaning, its necessary devastation. So if you take one thing away from this talk, it is to be brave about this. And here I defer to Rilke again. This is a long quote, but it's helpful, especially for me right now. So I'm going to read the whole thing. "It seems to me that almost all our sadnesses are moments of tension, because we are alone with the unfamiliar presence that has entered us, because everything we trust and are used to is for a moment taken away from us, because we stand in the midst of a transition where we cannot remain standing. That is why the sadness passes. The new presence inside us, the presence that has been added, has entered our heart, has gone into its innermost chamber, and is no longer even there, is already in our bloodstream. And we don't know what it was. We could easily be made to believe that nothing happened, and yet we have changed as a house that a guest has entered changes. We can't say who has come, perhaps we will never know, but many signs indicate that the future enters us in this way in order to be transformed in us long before it happens. The quieter we are, the more patient and open we are in our sadnesses, the more deeply and serenely the new presence can enter us, and the more we can make it our own, the more it becomes our fate." So I want to say something lastly about the danger of avoiding things. Philosopher and ethicist Cicely Bach claims in her book, which is called Secrets, that to be able to hold back some information about oneself or to channel it and thus influence how one is seen by others gives power. And it's a theory that's echoed by lots of people, including Winnicott, Piaget, and Jung, who sees the child's early revelation of silence as a necessary differentiation of self. And there is a difference between secrecy and privacy. But Cicely Bach and Carl Jung also agree that the freedom and power acquired in secrecy can backfire. When an idea or experience is isolated from the feedback and perception of others, she explains that secrecy can debilitate judgment and choice and spread and become obsessive. The secret space becomes a prison in which moral judgment and logic are starved and impaired, and development arrests. What I'm saying is, don't avoid yourself. The story that comes calling might be your own, and it might not go away if you don't open the door. I don't believe in writer's block. I only believe in fear. And you can be afraid and still write something. No one else has to read it when you're done, though you might want them to. Every book I've ever written, probably every essay I've ever written, began with a secret. So when I left the exhibit of Lorraine Hansberry's notebooks, I went home and I rewrote that monstrous essay, and I faced the truer version that I'd been avoiding because it was a better story and because I also wanted to be free. So before I finish, I want us to return to that list that you wrote. And I want to write about one of those things. And if you want to write, if the best you can do is write about why you can't write about it, then start there, but try to keep your hand moving. And let's go for like 10 minutes. And again, if you have to use code words, whatever will make it possible, I encourage you to burn this paper afterwards, or if you want to type it and then delete it, that's fine. But just for these 10 minutes, let's see what it feels like. and take a few moments to wrap up your thought. Okay. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. So I know very well the anxiety and thrill of writing about something that you didn't think you were allowed to write about. And I have in fact had so much experience of it that that feeling has taken on a different kind of meaning for me, which is that it's a sign that I'm on the right path, because it is the feeling that I have at the beginning of every good thing I've ever written. So if you have that feeling, it might mean the same thing for you. I don't know. But I guess the last thing I'll say is that I think that probably every single one of you could write something beautiful and deep about your own navel. And I think I could too. So that's it. That's all I got. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions if anybody has questions. And it doesn't have to be about anything I talked about today. If you have other craft questions or anything, I'm happy to talk about it. So I think there's a Q&A button, but there's also a chat. So I think if you put them in either place, I'll find them. Thanks, Aggie. Sandra just commented that she's never written so much so quickly. And the first time I ever figured this out was I was in my MFA program, and I was in the program in fiction. And I had been writing these like weird veiled fictional versions of my own experience, which were incredibly boring. And I took a nonfiction class as an elective. And one of the teacher, I actually took an undergrad class because I was so intimidated at the idea of writing nonfiction. And we had to write like a book report and an op-ed and a book review and an op-ed. And then the professor asked us to write a memoir, short memoir. And I started writing about having been a professional dominatrix, which I had never written about and never intended to write about. I thought maybe there'd be like a side character in a novel someday. And I had that experience. It was just like, it just like fell at, I mean, and it was like terrifying. And also I was like, whoa, writing can be like this, like not, pulling teeth. And that became my first book. And it was by far the best thing I'd ever written, and the whole thing was sort of like that, like, here it comes. Because it just like needed to be told, okay. Do you still have personal topics that you're uncomfortable writing? Of course I do. Although, it's funny, like I've had the experience so many times of writing about things I didn't think I could write about that I actually do now think. I'll always have the thought first, oh, I could never write about this. And then sometimes afterwards I'll think, ooh, does that mean I'm going to? Historically it does. But yeah, I always have a list of things that there's no way I could ever say them in writing. I mean, I've written about things that I still can't say. So let's see. Do you think fiction writers are hiding in their stories? Some, for sure. But I think that a lot of fiction writers actually feel like they can be more honest in their fiction, So, wherever that feeling comes from, right? That like sort of hot and scary and exciting feeling like you're getting close to something and the writing is bringing you there. I think people get it in all different forms, right? But people can hide in all different kinds of writing, and some do. But not necessarily. Fiction can be just as true as any nonfiction. Somebody asked, you spoke about lists. What are some other ways we might inventory? I mean, I don't know. It's totally up to you. But everything I write starts with lists, such that it's packed up now, but I have a mug that some of my undergrads who had taken multiple classes with me made for me that said, make a list with an exclamation point, because I said it to them every single class. Let's make a list. And for me, it's just like, what's floating around in there? You know what I mean? Like it's like my thinking is like 1% of what's good in here, what I'm just generally thinking about. And so I always have to take an inventory. Anytime I sit down to write an essay, I start with lists of just like things I remember about that topic or that event, feelings that I have about it, people I could interview about it. Like it's just lists and lists and lists. Also because the list is more accessible. It's so much easier to make a list than writing. You don't ever get to like cross things off in the same satisfying way. So I'm like definitely the kind of person that adds things I've already done to my list. So just so I can cross them off. Okay. You talked about writing, and even when you're done to keep going. Could you talk a bit about how you cut pieces down for publication, for synthesis or clarity? Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I write very long, which means I have to cut almost everything down. And I think because by nature, I am a very introspective, expository, like boring writer. I think, a lot of writers sort of fall into this camp. We're very good at images and description, and we could just do it forever. Nobody wants to read descriptions forever, right? So what happened for me was that and I think that I came by honestly, like when I was a kid, I started writing really young, and teachers were like, ooh, what beautiful sentences. So I was like, oh, that people like that. So I'll keep doing that. And I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it, and sort of overdeveloped that muscle and didn't really develop other things because I had the story that I wasn't good at them. And that included plot, dialogue, just like all the structural stuff. And I just wrote beautiful sentences and came up with striking images. Right. And I had an editor take pity on me when I was in grad school or just after, and she wrote back to one of my submissions, my many submissions to her magazine, and said, look, you write very beautiful sentences, but you have no idea what a story is. And maybe if you figure that out, we will one day publish something of yours. And I was like, thank Thank you. And people had probably been talking about this in my classes and I missed it, but I had never really thought about plot before. And I went and taught myself how to write a plot. And I went to Barnes and Noble. This was like after, going deeply into debt for my MFA program. I went to Barnes and Noble and I got all these like corny books about how to like write a thriller, right? And that led me to Aristotle's Poetics. And, I sort of gave myself an education in plot and how to not be fucking boring. There's something that Anne once gave a talk about at Breadloaf that has been added to what I know about plot that I think about really often, about her revision process and the necessity of toggling between sort of the tenor of a piece, like having conflict resolution, or just having that alternation so that there's always tension happening, not only in a scene, but from scene to scene and between them. And I think about that all the time when I'm revising. Anyway, all of that to say that for me, the most important thing I think about when I'm cutting a piece down is what is the central spine here? Because what I do is I take a plot, and that's usually my own experience, because that's what propels people through the story. And that's like the clothesline or the spine. And I hang everything else off of that. And I digress and I write about other people, or I talk about Foucault, or I bring in whatever. But it has that spine, right? Which if you subtracted it is probably only about like a sixth of the essay, but it's the necessary sixth that's pulling everybody through it, right? So I sort of, in most essays, I'll sort of pull that out and get rid of, I'm actually cutting a 20,000 word essay down to 8,000 words right now for a magazine. And that's basically what I did. I just took the plot and basically sliced all of the like smart digressions out of it. So that's one way to do it. If it's a differently structured kind of piece, I'll just pick one sort of movement in it. And it's just important, I think, for something to stand alone, it has to have that pivot. So I pick a pivot, right? And then I sort of work to bolster it up and make it feel more complete. But I really think mostly about stories, narrative structure and plot, so that it has that satisfying turn in it, like it moves somewhere, right? But usually my short pieces are just a really, really distilled version of the long piece. Sorry, that was a long answer. Do you have any tips for someone, me, who has no natural verbal filter, and how could I potentially use that as an asset in writing? I don't know, because I have a lot of verbal filter, but what it makes me think of is humor. Like having no verbal filter can, like, that's where a lot of humor, just saying the thing that no one else will say, is where most humor comes from. It's like the thing that we want to hide, right? And also, you can put everything you think into the first draft and then take away the stuff that's not necessary or that will hurt people unnecessarily. The beautiful thing about writing is that you get to do it alone, and as an editor, you're not talking, right? You're not just running your mouth. You can run your mouth in the first draft, but then you can go back and edit it. So I think that that's a huge gift, right? Most people have to work really, really hard to get to the unfiltered place where they're not like picturing their mom the whole time and can't even write the thing, right? So if you have a gift for having those blinders on and just saying the thing, like say the thing, say all the things, and then figure out how to shape it later. Let's see. Can you tell us about your journey from MFA to teaching creative writing? Did you always want to teach? And I think this will probably be the last question. And I think it is actually the last question in the box too. So my journey from MFA to teaching creative writing is could be a long story, but I will keep it short. I kind of did always know that I wanted to teach. Although I didn't really know what teaching was for a long time. I just like to boss people around and tell them what to read. So I always made my little brother like play school with me. And when I was a kid, I made a library out of I was already hoarding books as a child, and I made my bedroom into a library with all the little cards, and I would force my family to borrow them, and then I would try to charge them late fees. So also a hustler. And so I do think it was always sort of in me. And I did end up loving teaching. I don't think it's for everybody. It's okay if it's not for you. Wait to decide until you actually do some teaching, because you shouldn't be doing it if it's not fun for you. I find it incredibly fun because I am an extrovert, and writing is so solitary, and teaching is like performing plus talking about the thing I love all the time. And there's no boss around most of the time. You get to just have your own space and wear whatever you want. And for those of us who are performative and have issues with authority, it's really sort of can't be beat. So what I did was, when I was in my MFA program, they didn't have TA-ships, but they would sort of farm us out to a nearby school. And so I had a TA-ship where I worked in a composition classroom, which is where most people start teaching. And I taught like freshman writing. And then I worked as an adjunct for 7 years. Many people do it for even longer than that, but I earned my whole living being an adjunct, which was really intense. I had semesters where I was teaching 6 classes and commuting between like 3 or 4 different schools. And you know what? I finished my first book during that time, like on Metro North and the Long Island Railroad. Like I just made it work, partly because I wanted to get the fuck out of that lifestyle, which I erroneously thought that publishing a book would do. I guess it did in some ways. It didn't make me the money to get out of that lifestyle, but it did make me qualified for full-time teaching, which I was lucky enough to find pretty shortly thereafter. But you know, the thing that nobody told me in grad school was that being a professor is sort of like being in the military. Like you have to be willing to go live somewhere that you probably don't want to live to do like kind of a shitty, relative to other teaching jobs, job for a few years before you are really competitive for the jobs that you want in the end. So I'm telling you that now, so you know, because like the route that most of the people I know who have jobs they love went from adjuncting for anywhere from 1 to 20 years to teaching for a few years in a place they really didn't want to live with a really heavy teaching load, to a job that they liked a lot better. And then maybe after that, they get sort of like their dream job, as far as the tenure track. But it's really, really hard. But if you can, I think sort of the same thing about teaching that I do about writing, which is to say that if you really love it, and you never fucking give up, it will probably eventually work out. That has been the case for most of the people I know. It just probably will take a really long time, longer than you want anyway. But I feel unbelievably fortunate every single day that I get to do the work that I do. And that I don't have to work in the summers. It's a ridiculous scam. So that's that. Thank you guys for listening to me again.
Melissa, I could listen all day and all night. So when you got the question about the verbal, can't edit, and one of the pieces of advice you gave was say the things, say all the things, and there's a vote here that should be on a T-shirt. So
say all the things.
Say all
I think we should. I really think we should. I mean, everything I was ever afraid to say, that's always the stuff that people write me letters about. Always. I mean,
yeah.
you know what it's like when you hear someone say the thing that you've thought that you think you can't say. It's delicious. I love that. I would listen to people tell their secrets all day long.
And thank you for giving everyone the opportunity to try that a little. And I'm curious to hear some responses to that.
Yeah, I hope it was okay. I feel like I also want to say that if the psyche is very smart, and if you get a very strong no or start having a panic attack, stop. Don't do it.
Right.
Listen to your psyche. It's there to protect you. Being brave does not mean re-traumatizing yourself. That's it.
Melissa, thank you again. And we wish you safe trip.
Thank you.
Good time to Iowa and the wonderful start of a new adventure for you. So we're really excited.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. This was such a blast.
Bye, Melissa.
Bye, everybody.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you. You too.